Welcome to Terra Verde, a weekly environmental news and views program co-hosted by Earth Island Journal and KPFA and aired on KPFA and KPFB in Berkeley, KFCF in Fresno, and online worldwide at kpfa.org. I'm Maureen Nandini Mitra, the host and producer of today's show. I'm sure you all have noticed just how much the right to speak freely, to organize and protest injustice is under threat across much of the world right now. In the United States in particular, protesters, especially those focused on environmental justice and immigrant rights, are facing targeted violence from state forces. Yet, peaceful protest, which is a protected right in this country as well as many others, is a cornerstone of participatory democracy. Free speech, dissent, and public mobilization are essential tools for advancing so many causes, including environmental protection, workers' rights, human rights, climate justice, social justice, racial justice. On today's show, I have two veteran Berkeley activists, Annie Leonard and Andre Carruthers, whose new book, Protest, Respect It, Defend It, Use It, offers a powerful look at the role peaceful activism has played in advancing the public good over centuries. Featuring 42 iconic campaigns from around the world, the book provides a vivid testament to the power of public dissent and shines a light on the urgent need to protect this democratic right. Both Andre and Annie have been involved in campaigns and protests on issues of climate change, human rights, and environmental protection for many years. Both have been watching the increasing vilification of protest with growing concern. They are here today to talk with us about the importance and the power of peaceful protest, and about why we must exercise this fundamental right, even when the odds appear to be stacked against us. Annie, Andre, welcome to Terra Verde.
Thanks for having us.
Well, if we can start off, can one of you tell us a little bit about the impetus behind this book?
Well, you know, we've been around protests for a long time. Annie and I have been involved one way or another with trying to make change in the United States for a long time. And protest, you know, it's been such a central part of that. There's so many things that we are used to, you know, whether it's having the right to vote or, rivers that don't catch on fire. All these things were, if not made by protest, moved forward by protest. So the idea that the public square is under some sort of threat and that our ability to make our voices heard is being curtailed was a really strong motivator to remind people that this is one of our core democratic rights and that it's got us where we were today.
Right. So what are the risks that protesters are facing today, especially in this country?
There's a number of ways that protesters are being targeted right now. And while much of this is happening around the world, I will focus specifically on the United States. The first way that protesters are being targeted is through vilification. These false narratives that equate protesters with terrorists, danger, enemies of the state. These are becoming so prevalent in the news from political leaders, from business leaders. And that's really was the real impetus for this book, is we wanted to push back on this false narrative that protesters are enemies of the state or terrorists and show them that actually protests are heroes. So vilification is one way. Another way is the criminalization of protest. There's a whole new generation of anti-protest laws, and they tend to follow energy in a movement. So after the Black Lives Matter movement, there were new anti-protest laws, often supported by police unions, that specifically criminalized the kind of tactics that the BLM activists were using. After the Keystone and Pipeline and the Dakota Access Pipeline protest at Standing Rock, there were new laws that specifically targeted activists who were fighting fossil fuel pipelines. And we saw, and still are seeing, that after the explosion of the movement for Palestinian liberation and freedom, we saw a whole bunch of new crackdown on protests specifically aimed at the kinds of protests that pro-Palestinians were doing. So it's new laws that either criminalize constitutionally protected behavior or turn what used to be a misdemeanor into a felony. So, for example, trespass is a misdemeanor, but if you trespass near a fossil fuel infrastructure, then that's a felony. So that kind of criminalization. Another kind of attack on protests we're seeing are a kind of bogus lawsuit called a slap suit. SLAP is an acronym. It stands for Strategic Lawsuit Against Public Participation. And it's a lawsuit, a meritless lawsuit, that is not designed to make it to court or win in court, but it is designed to scare, intimidate, silence, and bankrupt opponents. So if you're, a farmer that's complaining about a pipeline that's going to come through your backyard and you get slapped with $100 million lawsuit, it's most likely you'll drop the campaign because it's very hard to fight these slap suits. And then we're also seeing a weaponization of the government apparatus. So things like international students who speak out on an issue that the administration doesn't agree with can lose their visas. Nonprofit organizations that speak out on an issue that the administration doesn't agree with could lose their nonprofit status. And we're certainly seeing this against journalists. You saw the journalists that were arrested for covering a protest in Minnesota. We're seeing a real use of the Department of Justice and the IRS and other government agencies to punish and silence dissent in order to create a chill. And it's really terrifying because the sum of it is denying us our First Amendment rights and denying us a really powerful tool for driving change.
We have stories that can illustrate this problem for you, if you like.
Yes, please. I know for sure, Annie, both of you were associated with Greenpeace, and the lawsuit in that regard has been one of those. It is a slap suit, right?
Yeah,
it
a slap suit.
And it has been, given where it played out, there was a negative outcome for activists on that front, which has far-reaching implications. Maybe one of you can talk about that.
While I was the executive director of Greenpeace for 9 years, we were slapped twice. Once from a Canadian forestry company called Resolute, but that case was heard in California, and California has anti-SLAPP legislation, which not all states do, and that's something that people can really advocate for, is get anti-SLAPP legislation in your state. So since California has anti-SLAPP legislation, the judge said that the lawsuit was a SLAPP suit, dismissed it, and even awarded Greenpeace some of the legal fees it had spent. The second SLAPP suit, Greenpeace was not quite as fortunate. It was a SLAPP suit, $300 million SLAPP suit, but from Energy Transfers, which is the company that built the Dakota Access Pipeline. And it was really a ridiculous lawsuit. It said that Greenpeace had orchestrated that indigenous-led protest and had actually manipulated Native Americans to get them to protest. I mean, it was very racist in its invisibilization of, or erasure of the indigenous leadership. That case was heard in North Dakota, which is a very oil-friendly and oil-dominated state. And in that case, tragically, Greenpeace lost. It is appealing it now, but it's facing the prospect of over $300 million, which is many times more than Greenpeace has in the bank.
I know. Well, let's hope the appeal works. Andre, you had some other examples maybe that you could cite?
Well, I've been thinking about this because 40 years ago this month, I was part of a group of activists that trespassed onto the Nevada test site to try to stop a nuclear test. And we hiked into the test site at night. We were able to get there in 2 days. We were able to bring out film to prove that we were there. And we were able to, over the course of a week and a half, stop them from blowing off a nuclear bomb underground. This was a part of a series of actions and arrests and demonstrations at the Nevada test site beginning in the 80s and stretching through the end of the decade, in which at the end there were over 500 demonstrations, there were 15,000 arrests, and finally, after this concerted effort punctuated by lobbying, protests, people going to Capitol Hill, people talking to legislators in Nevada, George Bush Sr. placed a moratorium on nuclear tests, and we haven't had this type of underground nuclear test since. So I was trying to imagine under the current legal regime what might happen if we tried to duplicate that 10-year process. And it becomes clear that, again, our elbow room, our ability to make our voices heard, is a lot different than it was 40 years ago. And what that means is we get less. We get less breakthroughs, less of our civil rights and our ability to control the future taken from us.
Right. You know, you said people should push for anti-SLAPP legislation in their state. I also wanted to touch upon the fact that there are so many anti-protest laws that you talked about that are being implemented at the state level or introduced. Maybe one of you can just give a slight overview of that.
Yeah, your listeners can go online and Google Protest Law Tracker, and you will see a map of the United States that shows you where laws have been proposed, where they're pending, and where they've passed. And there are literally hundreds of these anti-protest laws. And again, they really focus on protecting particular industries and outlawing practices that activists use. So marching down the streets in some places would now become a felony. I mean, you know, the marching down the street is a tried and true protest used from the suffragists to the civil rights movement. I mean, to have that right be taken away is really undemocratic and terrifying. In some places, training people in how to oppose a fossil fuel pipeline would now be illegal. In some places, raising bail money for people who have been arrested for fighting fossil fuels is now illegal. In some places, drivers are even given some level of indemnity for driving their car into peaceful protesters. So these laws are absolutely terrifying, undemocratic, and people should be up in arms about them because they are taking away both our constitutionally protected right and also a tried and true set of tools for driving change.
Yeah, so the triple threat here is selective prosecution. They pick the target that they want to take out. Charge aggregation, where they pile up these charges against people, including conspiracy, including all the things that Annie just mentioned. And then, of course, at the end of this, extreme sentencing. There is a woman who is on trial here in the Bay Area for being part of a group that blocked the Bay Bridge briefly. She was actually in a wheelchair, and she had a piece of paper on her chest that said media liaison. She's facing a collection of charges that includes unlawful imprisonment. And the unlawful imprisonment charge is based on the 120 people who were in cars that were briefly delayed while they broke up this demonstration. So these charges, charge aggregation, conspiracy, all of this is making it challenging to try to make your voice heard through nonviolent protest.
And that's what scares us, is how challenging it is to make your voice heard. Now, our democracy has never been fair and was far from perfect, but it was pretty stable. So activists could pretty securely assess the risks of doing different activities and decide whether or not they felt so morally compelled that they would take those actions in spite of the risks. But now what's happened is the risks are all over the place. You don't know what to expect. And as Andre said, much, much more severe repression.
Right. This is Maureen, and you're tuned into Terra Verde, a weekly environment radio show co-hosted by Earth Island Journal on KPFA and KPFB in Berkeley and KFCF in Fresno, and online worldwide at kpfa.org. If you're just joining us, I'm speaking with Annie Leonard and Andre Carruthers, veteran activists and authors of the new book, Protest, Respect It, Defend It, Use It, about the urgent and unprecedented threat to the right to free speech and protest we are facing right now, and why, despite this threat, it is important to continue exercising this fundamental right. Going back to the book, can one of you tell us something about the 42 stories in the book and why you chose to include them over the others?
Well, each of the stories represents some aspect of what we wanted to highlight, what we wanted to draw out for the reader. Some of the things that the reader will see is that a single person can make a difference. The story about Colin Kaepernick, who sort of spontaneously sat down during a preseason football game, the repercussions of that were amazing. There was immediate national focus on violence against Black people in America, police violence against Black Americans. There was enormous backlash, which of course got tons of media, and Colin's action It resulted in enormous amount of press and his ability to become a spokesperson and a leader in a issue that was on the national table at that time. We have other stories which demonstrate how nuanced an understanding of these protests should be. We begin almost with the Boston Tea Party. Now, everyone knows about the Boston Tea Party. They understand its centrality to the American story. But the interesting thing about it is when you look a little bit under the hood, what you discover is that first, it was not a popular event. There's stories throughout the book that demonstrate that at the time people are doing this work, at the time they're taking a risk or even simply joining along with others, it was not appreciated. Martin Luther King's disapproval rating was always above 50%. So what we're trying to make plain to our readers and everyone is that it is never popular at the time.
I really loved this small mention that, those little essays that you have in the book. And there's one where Rebecca Solnit writes that one of the most important and most overlooked functions of protest is to prevent the dreaded spiral of silence. I wondered if y'all could touch upon that a little bit.
I think the spiral of silence is a great metaphor because not seeing allies or not being an ally means that silence continues. Protest has been historically critical in bringing issues that were either not recognized or threats to a particular subpopulation in the country that needed the rest of the country to know about. And so seeing this in the street is an on-ramp to further engagement. And at this point, further engagement is what we need. There is a numbers game that's starting to occur now where if we are to successfully combat the authoritarian takeover, we need a lot of people out in the street, a lot of people supporting those people out in the street.
So in the book, we have 42 short stories about 42 different protests around the world and over the years. And then we have 12 guest voices. And we purposely picked people to represent as diverse of entree points as possible. So we have Nimoy Basi, an incredible activist and poet in Nigeria who has been fighting against fossil fuels in an authoritarian context. So we wanted to hear from him. We have Namante Nenquino, who's this wonderful indigenous woman in Ecuador, and she writes about her very existence, her continuing to live as an indigenous woman is an act of resistance. We have one of the early leaders in ACT UP, Peter Staley, who talks about the role of humor in disarming your opponent. These 12 essays provide so many different entree points. And part of the reason we did that is to make people feel welcome, but also to humanize the protesters. As the administration sort of vilifies them as terrorists and threats to national security, when you read these 12 voices, they sound like any one of us.
Since we're talking about those essays, I also wanted to lift up these words by Reverend Lennox Yearwood Jr. of the Hip Hop Caucus. And he wrote, "Standing up when you're expected to stay silent, it awakens a profound sense of connection to something greater than ourselves." You both have been active in many protests, and I wonder how that speaks to you.
A lot. At least I have been familiar with so many issues over the years, and they've been, in some ways, channels, working on nuclear weapons, working on nuclear waste, working on toxic waste. And to discover this late in life that there is a fundamental threat to our ability to make change in all those areas was very galvanizing. And what I'm noticing now is that as people begin to join the ranks of those that are defending democracy, there is a purposefulness to it, there is a joy to it, and there's a camaraderie to it that's just unmistakable. In some ways, it's hard to imagine a better time to be on the front lines because we are joining together to have the fight of a lifetime. And there is, again, there's joy and there's vigor and there is camaraderie that that helps you align sort of what you believe in your heart and mind to what you're doing in the street. And that alignment is very precious, and it feels good.
There are a number of voices in the book that affirm that being active, especially with others, being active in community, is the greatest antidote to despair that there is.
I also want to acknowledge that there's also a lot of fear right now. I mean, people want to be out there, but given the apparatus that is challenging our right to be out there, there is an inherent fear. So, in that context, where do we find that courage?
Well, when we think about protest, you often think about people marching down the streets. And I can absolutely understand why many, many people are nervous to do that in this repressive moment. So I want to encourage people to think very expansively about protest. Protest can take so many forms. When millions of people canceled their Disney subscription to punish Disney for canceling Jimmy Kimmel, that was an act of protest. In Minnesota, when carpenters drove around and fixed the doors of immigrant families that ICE had kicked in, that was an act of protest. There are many, many different ways, and people should not do things that jeopardize their safety or their family's safety or that they don't feel comfortable to, because there's so many ways to be an effective part of the resistance. If you can protest, you can do childcare for the people who are protesting. You can make sandwiches for the people who are protesting. You can help do the taxes if you're an accountant for the people who are afraid to come out of their house that need help with their taxes. I mean, there's really so many ways. Are you a graphic designer? Are you a poet? Whatever skill set you have, the movement needs it, and there's a way to engage. Andre, do you want to talk about the neighborizing thing? Sorry.
Well, I do, because I spent some time trying to catalog the ways in which people in Minneapolis and the surrounding area defended each other. And I counted 27, and then I stopped because I realized it could go on for a long time. A term emerged from Minneapolis and its environs, which is called neighborism. And what they mean by that is obvious, that there are so many ways to contribute. It is scientifically proven that if someone takes a little step forward in pursuit of something they believe in, say they put their toe in the water, then it's highly likely that next time they are asked or next time they're presented with the opportunity, they will be knee deep. And then by the time it really becomes important, they're waist deep. And so the networks that are developing, using Minneapolis as an example, and the networks that are developing of people who are signing up for, say, a local email list. Here in the Bay Area, it's Bay Resistance. Nationally, it's Indivisible. And being invited to listen in on the phone calls and show up somewhere, they are very likely going to be extremely useful to get us our democracy back. This phenomenon of...
That's very encouraging, but I also want to touch a little bit upon resistance fatigue. It's always a long fight. Fights for independence are long fights. How do you sustain your momentum through that? How do you deal with, maybe, say, for a lot of activists, there might be a lot of guilt in not being able to do that, or being fatigued and needing to take some time and then coming back,
I'm glad you raised that, because as we've been doing our book events, a sense of overwhelm and despair and fatigue is something that we're seeing in every single community. And so first of all, we have got to give ourselves permission to make space for joy and community and the things that sustain us, whether it's hiking in the woods or spending time with your children or grandchildren. That is not taking us away from the resistance. That's investing in our ability to maintain our role in the resistance. And in fact, that's actually a form of resistance. There's nothing an authoritarian wants more than having us be isolated, alone, silent, miserable, and scared. And so by refusing to be all of those things, that is an embodiment of the resistance. So take time to sing, to dance, to hike, to meditate, to whatever it is that can keep you going. On the longer term, the only way I can think of to solve this is that once we get through this very bad period of our governance history, we have to not go back to where we were in 2020 or 2016 or 2014. That's not what we're talking about here. We have got to take advantage of this to really address the underlying injustices, inequality, racism, the underlying issues that fomented into this horribleness that we're seeing now. So that what we build together in the long run, and it's going to take a long time, but what we build together is something better than we've ever had before.
Andre, do you want to add to that?
Well, I'm an older person now, and I've reminded myself that when I was born, the year I was born, there were still segregated water fountains across the South. When I was a teenager, there was no access to my middle school for people with disabilities. There were no curb cuts, there were no widened doorways, there were no wheelchair ramps. In the 70s, a woman had to, or it was legal for a bank to ask a woman to provide her husband's signature to get a credit card. And so, yes, as you said, Maureen, there's a lot of fatigue out there, and we're playing a long game. There have been cycles of repression in this country, and then a flurry of rights attainment, and then back to repression again. And one of the reasons I think we're experiencing so much backlash right now is because of the successes in history. So the long game is what we're playing.
Rebecca Solnit has written such a fabulous book that we just have to give a nod to, called The Beginning Comes After the End. And she makes the case, this very case, that we're not actually losing, we're winning. All those kinds of examples that Andre just said, things are moving in a good direction, and this current pushback on that is in many ways a pushback to all of the social and environmental and other progress that we've made. We still have a long way to go, but I really do believe that the moral arc of the universe does bend towards justice. It needs some help. It's not a smooth arc, but the trajectory is good.
I did want to also touch upon this one last line. It's also from Reverend Yearfood, and it says, each generation must fight anew. So,
I remember when I was in my 20s and just graduated from college and worked 18 hours a day and was just totally manic and thought, okay, we are going to solve the environmental crisis by the time I'm 30. And I thought it was a sprint. And then in your 30s and 40s, you sort of realize, okay, I got to pace myself. This is going to take longer than I thought. And people often say, you think it's a sprint, and then you realize it's a marathon. So now that Andre and I have both passed 60, I will say it's neither a sprint nor a marathon. It's a relay race. And what we want to do is protect the democratic tools and institutions and norms so that when we pass the baton to the next folks, they have what they need to keep moving forward.
That's beautiful. Well, that's all I have time for on today's show. Thank you, Andre and Annie, for joining us today to help us understand how we can find the resources within ourselves and our community to keep the resistance up. You can find their new book, Protest, Respect It, Defend It, Use It, at patagoniaworks.com. Music for Terra Verde was produced by David Michel Ruddy. You can find Terra Verde and other KPFA programs archived at kpfa.org. You can also find select episodes of Terra Verde on Earth Island Journal's podcast page at earthislandjournal.org. Have a great weekend, everyone.
Y acá estamos, luchando con todo el dolor del mundo. Acá estamos.
Ever wonder where all the alternative voices went? We found them. They're right here at KPFA. No fluff, no spin, just the truth and the stories that matter. Tune in on kpfa.org and click on the Listen Live button and hear what you've been missing.
Acá estamos.
Tantas tierras en el mundo.
You are dialed into the mighty 94.1 KPFA and 89.3 KPFB in Berkeley, 88.1 KFCF in Fresno, and online everywhere at kpfa.org.
Yo ya no sé más lo que hacer.